Hello, everybody, and welcome to another exciting interview in my series, What is Language Coaching? I'm Rachel Paling, and I am thrilled to actually be connecting with North America today. So do forgive us if we have some technical sound issues in the background. We're doing very well so far with the sound, so I'm hoping that it hangs there and keeps in with this wonderful clear sound that we have. And let's say my guest today is absolutely somebody who has over 20 years experience, specializes in affective education, so very much specialized with that affective filter by Stephen Krashen, and all those language trainers and educators out there know, I'm sure, what I'm talking about. So may I introduce Dr. Alex Monceax. Hi, Alex. How are you?
Hey, I'm doing well, Rachel. Thanks for having me on.
Well, I'm thrilled. I really am. And, we met some weeks ago in Bolivia, and we had the most amazing time at that conference. And we really had some very deep, interesting chats now and again. And this is one of the reasons I wanted to get your expertise onto this podcast. So can you tell the listeners a little bit about your background, your journey, and what you actually do?
Sure. So my journey in teaching, I guess, probably started back in the early 90s in the food industry. I started as a corporate trainer for wait staff. And it seems strange, but later on I would go back to school and get an education degree and start teaching K through 12. The first school I worked in, pre-K and kinder, and the majority of our population were second language learners. About 90% of the class or the population there were Hispanic. And so there was a huge need for ESL or bilingual methodology. And so while I hadn't studied that, it was something that we had to kind of pick up and use to be effective for teaching.
Right.
So I taught for several years in K through 12, and then later went back to the university and got involved in testing and assessment. And then in 2006, I started teaching in the evening the ESL courses for the university, and those were primarily graduate students. They may be masters, mostly master's students, some PhD level students who were coming to the university to study, but they needed language training so they could complete their studies. We focused on academic writing and reading primarily, or that was my focus. And since 2006, that's primarily where I've been teaching graduate level students, academic writing, academic reading skills. Currently, I'm Associate Director of the Pathway Program at Lamar University. So I'm over the faculty aspect, instructional aspects of the program. And we do a variety of things. We do English for specific purposes, academic English, and work with corporations or other universities globally to create kind of opportunity for development, as well as teacher training. So we have a master's in teachers with a concentration in ESOL, and over the ESOL concentration. So that's where what I'm currently doing. That's kind of my journey here, which gives me, I guess, a little over 20 years of work in education. Almost all of that really focused on dealing with second language learners.
Right. Right. And Alex, just tell us a little bit more about this specialization you have with the affective filter.
Well, so I've got a degree in counseling, and counseling does certain things. That's not language learning, but it is a kind of learning, personal learning, personal growth. And so I spent a year teaching at Yonsei University in South Korea. While in South Korea, many of my students were faculty there at the university. And so one of their points was that they had been studying English for years, some of them 20, 30 years, but were still unable to speak the language.
Right.
And so I went back to my counseling background and started pulling techniques to kind of untangle that, figure out what's going on. Because if you're studying something that long, many of them knew all the rules. They could correct me on many things, but they weren't able to apply those rules into their language. So there's this kind of strange thing that's happening. The cognitive knowledge is there, but it's not being integrated into their life. So how do you bridge that gap?
Yeah.
And so it was during that time I became more familiar with Creshen's work on the affective filter. And I used counseling concepts of the affect to work with my students on creating an environment, mostly internal, where they could learn the language and it allowed them to grow. And my students responded really well to that. So when I returned back to the United States, I began to work, began to kind of start doing some research on what that meant, like what is the affective filter specifically.
Yes.
I began to ask that question. Creshen had kind of posed that to us in '79, but no one really had a clear understanding of what the affective filter was, how many filters there were, and how you mitigated those. And so I contacted Creshen, and we'd be talking about it. I also was interested in how he connected the affective filter to Bloom's taxonomy, which is 3 learning domains, and that had been around since the 50s.
Yeah.
And so Creshen wasn't necessarily helpful in connecting it to the affective domain. He said it didn't really, but he did talk about how the affective filter was really just 2 filters. There's an input filter and output filter. And from our discussion, I was able to kind of understand that the idea is really just kind of descriptive. And as such, it doesn't give us a way into the problem. It just demonstrates that there is a potential for a problem that we need to understand and know, which creates, it's great. It just doesn't solve the issues. Teachers now know something, but they have no way of figuring it out. So using that, I went back to Bloom's taxonomy and started looking at affective education and how that worked and where it had been used and what it meant. So much of my doctoral work focused on affective education and looking at how the affect is kind of the entry. It's the gatekeeper for both the psychomotor and the cognitive elements.
Yeah. Yeah. And honestly, Alex, I personally think that Creshen was before his time, because now from the neuroscience, we are actually having that physical proof of how the limbic system reacts, how, just one drop of cortisol affects learning and neuroplasticity. And we're now seeing from the neuroscientific evidence, exactly, if you like, we have the proof of the filters, would you say?
Well, sure. So I think this is kind of the inherent problem in education right now, and maybe where the shift will occur. Back when they began talking about education, they weren't able to see things very tangibly. So we jumped on behavioralism,
yes,
the cognitive, because behaviors and actions are easily seen, and then we can use scientific approaches adjust behaviors. And so that cognitive behavioralist approach to education is where we've been for the last 100+ years.
Right.
And we've made progress in that.
Yeah, absolutely.
But it's really a symptom of what we're able to study as a researching body. However, since perhaps the late 90s and 2000, with neuroimaging and the ability to get in, MRIs, look at structures, physical structures, and how they're changing in real time, has allowed us to understand more affect and how those other dimensions of the person are affected and in really measurable, concrete terms, rather than just a narrative query or phenomenological queries. We can put numbers to it and measure it, and this is really powerful for education, since people like numbers often better than they like just the stories.
Yes, absolutely. So in all your years of experience from 1999 until now, how do you see that the whole English or language learning market has changed?
Well, I think it's a slow process. Education departments are largely rooted in the literature. Textbooks are written, and it takes years to get a textbook. So education lags behind the most current research. It just is that way. So teachers are trained in certain kind of methods that may be old, and then those are perpetuated by older teachers presenting at conferences. Some people repeat things that they've learned 20 years ago and kind of perpetuate them, but don't come up with new ideas or present new things at the conferences. And so students or learners for education are kind of in a stew of what has been.
Right.
There has to be kind of a move out of the practitioner model in education, for change to really occur. Teachers have to decide that they're practitioner scholars. They have to begin looking at their class and thinking about what's going on in the class, develop ways of assessing their class, assessing their own teaching strategies, and doing it critically to advance the field. And I think we see this. There's been a push for action-based research within the teaching field,
Right.
and more people are being trained in it, and it's allowing us to see where gaps in instruction are occurring, even if it's just within one context. But having a way to kind of see that, make it concrete, gives educators a way to move forward. So
Yes.
we are seeing progress.
Yeah. And may I be provocative and say, well, of course, neuro-language coaching is one of those new approaches, and that's exactly what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to bring in new ways, new approaches, plus getting and gathering the evidence in the background of the impact. So I'm in it, Alex, I promise.
Yes, I really believe that. I think the action-based research and practitioner scholar model really is helpful because it demands that the instructor go out and look at literature.
Yes.
And so I think this is one place where you're at, and realizing that what you're doing may not be as effective as you hope, and so go and find things that may be effective, that may be outside of the ESL literature or
Yes.
the education literature, and go, well,
yeah.
Other people are solving these problems through this method. Maybe if we apply that to where we're at, then we can get some new information or better results. And so I think that's specifically what's going on with language coaching,
yes.
is
Yeah.
you're reaching into cognitive science,
Yeah.
neuroscience, and other fields. You're looking at how coaching is working, perhaps in an executive executive context and saying, okay, these things are working.
Yeah.
Maybe we can try that in a language context and see how the results work.
Yeah.
And so that's, I think, where we're heading in education, with a push for a scholar practitioner model and action-based research that empowers educators to go do this. Really can create avenues for growth.
Yeah. You've just reminded me, actually. I was, some time ago, I was surprised to see there was some study in the US about educators and about neuroscience. And one of the questions was, how confident are you to bring out neuroscience and neuroscientific principles into your teaching process? And honestly, surprisingly, I think there are about 80% who answered they are not confident.
Sure, because I think most people's background is not in that. There's not really courses that you take at the university in education departments that focus on neuroscience.
Right.
And so if you go to a conference, I mean, if you were to do a study of 100 conferences that focus on education, or maybe even ESL education, and kind of survey through all of the courses or all the presentations that are offered, you would probably be under 5%. I'm just guessing, but you'd be under 5%, I imagine, that deal with neuroscience, unless you went to a specific conference that was neuro-linguistic, our brain.
Or neuroeducation.
There are some places that really kind of focus on this, but it's not the norm, and only some specific kind of people go to those conferences. And so until it's more common, then we can't really move forward.
Right. Now, I'd like to ask you, because, we are seeing a phenomena of language educators calling themselves language coaches. So what do you think about that?
Well, I've often avoided using the word coach and chosen mentoring. And the reason is coaching is a kind of strange, foggy construct. I think we know what coaching isn't, but it's really difficult to nail down what coaching is.
Right.
In the literature, everyone has an opinion of what coaching is and what it means to be effective. So when I began looking at this around 2014, the literature really suggested there's not much literature on what it meant to be a coach. You had a lot of phenomenological kind of studies looking at, well, how did a coach affect you? What aspects of coaching were helpful? Looking at maybe a variety of different coaching styles, but it was really limited. And so this creates a problem to figure out what the word means and how do we incorporate it into a new context, such as language coaching. When even sports coaching is really difficult to understand.
Yes.
One article I remember talks about coaching is more about what is done, how something is done rather than what is done. And so that's a whole new kind of caveat. Like, there's not a list of things you do as a coach, but it's how you do things, and perhaps how the person that's being acted on is receiving that. So this kind of bilateral relationship creates the coaching relationship, which is hard then to standardize and make scalable in any way.
Right.
So, I think it's difficult, right? We're doing more research. It's perhaps in the last 10 years, I think the literature has probably doubled. We see that coaching as a concept, specifically kind of in education leadership, in a business sense, say for CEOs, that it's doing some really incredible work. So that context is kind of being more standardized. We understand that coaching kind of reduces anxiety and stress, that those who are involved in the coaching process become greater collaborators. They have higher self-efficacy.
Yeah.
They have better goal attainment.
Yeah.
They're more resilient. Their well-being and depression is better. These aspects of their being are better. So well-being is higher, and it reduces depression. So coaching has some really, even as nebulous as it is, coaching has some really great benefits. So I think as educators, we would kind of, it behoove us to start looking at, well, what is coaching, and how do we integrate those aspects into a classroom?
Right. Right. And may I say, Alex, just to share with you, when I was in Bolivia, after you'd gone, I did actually do some volunteer work with some teachers. And in fact, in one meeting with a group of about 25 language teachers from a school in a district of Bolivia in Santa Cruz, where they really have, difficult circumstances, children with difficult backgrounds and really struggling. And, speaking with these teachers and speaking to them about the brain, about the coaching approach, one of them actually said, it sounds like having a coaching approach actually would help us much more to reach these kids and to connect with them. What do you think about that?
Well, I think education is in this kind of place where, what is the teacher? The question is, what is the teacher, and what's the teacher's role?
Yeah.
And some feel that they need to be in front of the class, and they are the beacons of knowledge. They hold all knowledge.
Yeah.
But I think that's an old worldview, and away from that, we understand that students bring a great deal of knowledge to the classroom. Their experiences are important, and allowing them to share those experiences is critical, not just for the one individual, but for the group.
Yes.
And creates a better environment in the classroom. So that is a move to a facilitator or a coach, however you wish to kind of describe it.
Yep.
And so I think we know that's right, that's the better move. Someone coming in as a leader, and rather than pushing and beating and deriding students, kind of trying to meet them individually where they're at.
Yes.
Develop interpersonal relationships.
Yes.
That are still professional,
yeah,
but that make a connection to the student and help move them on. This kind of personal interest that's contextualized is a better approach to learning, rather than just coming in and providing a lecture, writing some notes on the board, and then exiting the classroom. We know this is a better model.
Right. So how do you think then the future of language learning really looks?
Well, I think every context is really different. And so it's hard to it's hard to do that. Where will we go? I think there has to be an inclusion of the affect and the psychomotor. At some point, educators have to start looking at the students, whether it's language students or science student. You have to start understanding the whole body, the whole what's going on. And so looking at the psychomotor, what are students ready to do, whether it's physically or intellectually or emotionally? How can they use the knowledge to go forward? And so the psychomotor domain really works with this. Students, I studied Korean for a year. I can't speak it. I can understand much of what people are talking to me or around me. I can get it, but I can't speak it. And that's about a psychomotor issue. The words are in my head, but something's going on that makes me reticent in those in that environment. With friends that I'm really comfortable with, sometimes my affective filter changes and my output filter opens up, and I can produce things a little better.
Yes.
So this is a consideration of the psychomotor, and until educators learn about the psychomotor, not just in primary ages, but how that affects adults, and what are the contexts for the psychomotor, and how do we get students, learners, moving forward in what using their knowledge and being able to produce it, and not just produce what they've learned, not parroting, right, but being able to start kind of change things and be creative and masters of what they're doing, creating new things. Until we start looking at that aspect of learning, it's really difficult to move forward.
Yes.
And I think key to the psychomotor is the affect, right? Understanding what students are receiving. So there's so many reasons why students aren't receiving the information we're giving. And I think there's an axis here, right? It depends on who's in the classroom or who's delivering the information, or, right? Or this identity type issue, and
Yes.
and what else is going on, or what's being learned.
The external influences, yeah.
Right, and so the where are you? Some situations stop. Here we've played with the sound, and sometimes the sound or the environment creates certain kinds of some problems. And so just looking at these kind of axis of where receiving information, whether it's a physical aspect, a biological, or emotional aspect, this is an affective issue. And so making sure that students or learners are getting what is being presented and are able to then respond. The response then is a psychomotor. How well are they responding? What ways are we opening up for them to respond, so that they feel comfortable with that?
Right.
And so there can't be growth until we consider these things. You can't just keep stuffing things into people's heads, and banging away at the brain and saying, no, produce, and slapping them on the back and say, spit it out, right? If you're not thinking of these other things, well, then there's not really an avenue into that.
Yeah, I totally agree.
And I think go ahead.
No, I totally agree. And you talk, let's say, from that language, but what we are doing with the neuroscience and the coaching is exactly what you're saying. It is that bringing teachers and educators to really understand the external influences, the brain influences, the learner, that holistic being, or beings, if it's a group, sitting in front of us. And that's what it boils down to, isn't it? Really, Alex?
Yeah, I think that's essentially it. Researchers looking at coaches and kind of thinking about the best athletic coaches that exist out there, looking at what they've done. They create these kind of categories, and they say they have extensive specialized knowledge, that they organize the knowledge hierarchically, that they're perceptive, highly perceptive, that they're superior problem solvers. They teach kind of automatically, and they self-monitor. So I think these are key skills for the instructor in the classroom working with one or several students, having a great grasp on your content and leveling that content. What's important, what's the big picture, and how do we get to the smaller things? Being perceptive, like what's going on with the student, where are their gaps, what are they missing, how can I reteach, how, even for the one, how can I make sure that the students are moving, solving the problems, right? Not just realize that there is a problem and realizing gaps, but negotiate those spaces.
Yes. Yes.
And
Yes.
and creating ways to kind of, that if lessons are more static, that you just know this information, you're presenting it out there, well then a lot of the energy of teaching can then be diverted into perceiving,
Yes.
and solving problems and seeing what's going on, because you're not focused on getting information out. You're able to focus on, okay, how is it being received? What's their body showing me? What's their face showing me?
Yeah. Yeah.
How are they responding to these things?
Yeah.
And so the more knowledge you have about content and ease in which you're able to deliver, kind of opens these other facilities for the coach. And I think we need to get to that point. That's a difficult point to get to in education. That allows the opportunity for coaching.
Right.
I
Yes.
think for learning, you have to move beyond the response, and so using these type of things, characteristics of a coach, gets us to students responding, but perhaps the way into the response is having the students connect with the information. And that's an affective issue, right? So
Yes.
some students hate it. They hate what you're trying to teach them, and that's perfectly all right. Some teachers focus so much on that they don't like it, and try to change their minds. But I really think that's futile. What's more important is, why don't you like it? And if you come at the conversation even allowing the negative space, well, then the students are using the language, they're talking about it, and they have to give reasons. And so basically, when you connect to the value system, then you create a greater way for them to dive in and understand themselves, understand their world, understand what's being taught. Whereas if you know you need to appreciate this, well, then the student doesn't really have an option. They just shut down.
Right. Right.
And you enter this kind of power struggle.
Yeah. Alex,
and so
we're going to wrap up,
yes,
because we're sort of running out of time here. And
Sure.
I really totally and utterly agree with everything you're saying. And maybe in the future, let's think about another podcast where we come back into this topic and we really take that affective education and you really share with us even more than today. So thank you.
Yes, thank you. And I appreciate you giving me the opportunity to talk to you and your viewers.
And do you know, as you were talking just now, what came to my mind was that amazing quote from Benjamin Franklin: "Tell me and I forget, teach me and I remember, involve me and I learn." And I'm going to leave that as the final word for today's podcast. So join me, everybody, for the next interview. Have a super week wherever you are. Bye-bye.